Thanks for tuning into this episode of FinTech Focus TV, powered by Harrington Starr, the global leaders in financial technology recruitment. Head over to the Harrington Starr website where you'll be able to find all the latest jobs in financial technology across the globe. You'll also be able to download the latest issue of the Financial Technologist magazine, including the Top 1% Workplace Awards. Finally, if you're looking to grow your team, please get in touch. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to another episode of FinTech Focus TV with me, Toby Babb. Today I am joined live in the studio with Richard Baker from Tokenovate. How are you?
Really well. Good to see you, Toby.
Likewise. Listen, thanks so much for coming in. We enjoyed a really interesting debate the other day where we sat down and talked about whether 2024 was the year that digital assets really made it to the mainstream, etc. It was a fascinating conversation.
It was.
You held your own. We had a really good fun with it, and I really appreciated getting to know you and having that conversation as well. We're going to be talking a little bit more about that. We're going to be talking about your business and in a very, very exciting space over the course of the next year. We're filming this at the end of 23. We're going into 2024 with a lot to happen across all markets. I think last time I spoke to you, just come back from Asia, where you were talking about that sort of part of the world that really taking off into everything.
Exactly.
We've got a lot to talk through today.
We have, yeah.
Before we do that, Richard, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about the business and where you are and where the company is now.
Great to see you again, and fantastic panel. So thank you for putting that on and inviting us. Well, Irishman, firstly. That gets my accent out of the way, I think, Toby.
I don't think anyone's questioning it.
No, UK resident, moved from Ireland a long time ago, live in Cambridge in the UK. Technology is my background. I grew up in optical networks and voice networks in the late 80s and 90s. A bit of time in digital media, and I only give this introduction because my own journey into financial services started in 2009 when I founded and built a futures exchange in Singapore. So it was a regulated market in Singapore, operated in the US, and entered the world of commodity derivatives. Mm-hmm. I have a deep passion for kind of everything bleeding edge technology. I love solving major problems for the world with new technology and trying to spend as much time with customers helping them solve real issues with bleeding edge technology. That's always been my motivation, I think, in life.
I love that as well.
It's exciting. I always like being on that frontier. I was a little bit disappointed by adoption cycles, I think. Yeah. So you have to, I think as I get a little older,
it takes a little bit longer than you anticipate.
It does, yeah. So the hype always has a lag as well in terms of when things really come into their own and get really adopted. But that to one side, I founded Tokenovate here in the UK in early 2022 with a very good friend of mine, Jared Banaskovich. So Jared and I are the co-founders. I'm the kind of technology product visionary and enjoy sales and marketing, and Jared is the operational finance and get it done guy. So we're very complementary. yeah, it's really good fun, and I think that's a learning as well when I've put together a few startups over my time, and I think getting that recipe right at the start in terms of the mix of the founders, but then the mix of the leadership team that you bring together with you is critical to determining success, and we'll come back on that in a people discussion. So what does Tokenovate do? It's a play actually on legal novation and the concept of tokenization. So we are amidst a very significant transformation, in my opinion, in financial services. We are seeing all trading styles start to digitize and ultimately get automated. And smart contracts, tokenization, blockchain technology, blended a bit with cloud, is at the heart of that transformation around the world. And so Tokenovate is focused on over-the-counter derivatives, and we are building a life cycle engine to automate derivative trading. And derivative trading is probably underpinning about 1 quadrillion of the world's trade. Every asset class in the world has a derivative, and it underpins everything from bonds to interest rates to commodities. So huge market, big opportunity.
Certainly sounds it as well.
Yeah,
and
really.
There's a lot to unpack from all of that you just said. First and foremost, though, I do have to say, I love that sort of passion you have for the space. I love the passion for technology and how it can change the world, not just on a sort of micro basis, and making systems better, but how can we actually put ourselves into a position to create something there that's genuinely game-changing. And I think that's a really important aspect of what you're talking about there. And you, particularly when we talk about the technology behind digital assets, that's where I think so many people have got the real excitement about where they're going. So I loved hearing about that side of things from you.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I find the market really confusing, actually, Toby. And I think big enterprises, financial services companies, find it very daunting, to be honest.
There's a lot of demystifying.
There is a lot of demystifying. Yeah. Blockchain has obviously been around as an engineering concept. It's been around since the 50s. But its modern history is really 15 years old now. If we go back to when the Bitcoin white paper was published, and that talked about a digital cash, a peer-to-peer system for the world. The promise of that was all about modernizing electronic payments, and particularly it envisaged micropayments, not the kind of cash that we have grown up with in the last 30, 40 years. And we've seen that. All of us are somewhat digital native these days. All our credit cards and debit cards are encoded on our phones. We tap pay for the majority of goods these days, so we're already quite well digitized. So the next step on from that is, what does the money rails system behind tokenized money really look like for transactions on the internet, but also transactions in institutional finance? And so we've got a lot of technologies that have emerged in the last 14 years wanting to start to participate in interbank currencies or stable coins or modernize wholesale payment rails. How do we tokenize real world assets? How do we start to tackle bigger topics like the mobility of collateral? Collateral in how you apply collateral to a derivative trade is really quite cumbersome. It takes a lot of manual processes in mid and back office to say, okay, when we first enter a trade, we have to post initial margin, then we can maintain the trade with variation margin, and there's a lot of eligibility rules on actually what collateral can be used across those trades over its life cycle. Tokenovate's tackling when I tokenize an asset, I want to express it as near a lookalike as cash as I possibly can. And tokenization brings in the concepts of rights management and who owns the private public key, and what are the privileges and the governance structure of a token. How do I move that rights management from the buyer to the seller to allocate the collateral in a trade? And I only call that out because I think the demystifying is when you've really watched the rise of cryptocurrencies for the last 10 years, we think of tokens through the lens of a cryptocurrency. But actually tokens are really just using digital code to encode rights management and portability techniques and key management, who can do what when. I think about all of this through the lens of conditional logic. All of these are just conditional logic systems.
Yeah, it's a fascinating sort of play, isn't it? And you can see when you look at that sort of some of the traditional asset classes, such as derivatives, etc., that there is the opportunity to innovate, to improve, to take things further forward. And that's exactly where you're at the heart of it, with the whole process of automation and standardization, everything in between it, right?
It is, yeah. And I think, firstly, maybe we put that in context for the industry. Financial services, really since 2008, has had quite a lot of new regulatory rules to deal with. So I think the burden of regulation and compliance, whether you look at things like capital adequacy and Basel III rules, how much capital do you have to hold on your balance sheet? You have to pass certain liquidity and asset tests every year, through to actually, in the same vein, how much capital do I have to hold on my balance sheet or in custody accounts to be able to service the trades that I enter into on a daily basis and maintain those trades. So when we look at the concept of something like collateral mobility, and you consider it through the lens of the rules and the regulations on an international level, it brings in an awful lot of conditional logic complexity. Where do I have an asset? Which sovereign region is it sitting in? How do I describe that asset? Is it property? Is it cash? Is it a bond? And how do I express it so that it is more mobile and can service the large bond trades or the large cash trades or commodity trades that I enter in and out of? And obviously, derivatives are used largely for risk management and hedging purposes. And they're there to smooth out the P&L and for the business. Underpinning this is the world's dependency on trade finance and actually merchant trade. And so actually getting this right and helping this mobility is really important, because it's going to ease up friction in the system, but it's actually going to improve liquidity. And to me, I think it's going to actually really pave the way for the next generation of merchant trade and digital finance. And it will increase actually participation in the market.
Which is so important, isn't it? Because if you look at that and think, right, what is the great mover of, when you talk again to that sort of that sort of mantra at the start of improving the world through through technology, the financial services system has a massive opportunity to improve that. Going back to 2008 and the mishaps that happened through there and the necessary regulation that came in, it creates an awful lot of friction for people to move through to be as efficient within that. And I always talk about this, when costs are rising every single year across every single aspect of running a business, you've got to look at productivity increase, and you've got to look at efficiency gains through all of that, and you've got to make it, with a digital society who are used to everything on their phone, as easy as possible. The whole thing comes down to, I need every aspect of my life to be as friction-free and easy as possible. And that to me is exactly where this sits, right?
Correct, yeah. And actually, beyond the regulatory drivers, and I guess in a high inflation, high interest rate market, yes, that pushes an even greater burden on how you use your collateral assets. But let's also not forget that demographics are changing around the world. I think early in 2023, I was reading a report on, we've got a real transformation going on in front office. We've got a younger generation of traders sitting at terminals and broker desks, and they are more multitasking for the very reason that they're digitally native. They've grown up with the ability to multitask across data streams.
Yeah.
And so we've seen a change in that actually younger generation traders cover multiple products. They don't cover just one product anymore.
Yeah.
And so that's already a strong indication of convergence in the front office of how many assets are represented on a terminal and a trading desk, and their ability to manipulate and harvest and put trends and data together.
It's fascinating, that, isn't it? Looking at it from a generational standpoint, because I've been speaking to a lot of people recently about development of people and talking a lot more about snackable content and how people learn and how people develop in a completely different way to the way we did 20, 30 years or so ago. And actually to think of that in terms of expectations, I think just in terms of instant gratification of everything at various different phases, that comes into all the aspects of the trade life cycle at the same stage as well.
It does, and I think if you're beginning to see that kind of modern appetite at the front office, where actually the kind of friction is already being broken down and removed, what it tells you is that mid and back office functions need to change. We need to digitize and we need to automate further, because it's only by removing mid and back office friction that we're going to be able to allow those front offices to actually do more and achieve more. And so I'd like to maybe delve into that a little bit, which is, what are we really talking about with digitization and automation? Well, I think firstly, I would even go one step before, which is, I believe it's very difficult to digitize something unless you've actually got standards to digitize. So in our world, in the derivatives world, most participants in a derivative will use a few master legal agreements, and the one that is standout in the world is something called ISDA, the International Swaps and Derivatives Association Master Agreement, catchy. So the ISDA Master has been around since the early 80s. It underpins a significant amount of derivative trade in the world. And actually ISDA has been leading the charge over the last 4 or 5 years in effectively standardizing and getting ready the master agreement and its supporting credit agreement schedules for digitization. So what does that actually mean? Well, they've codified the master agreement. So you and I could now digitally negotiate an ISDA master agreement for a bond or an interest rate derivative that we want to enter into. And so that negotiation expresses in code form against a digital library. And that really makes it much easier for participants to have the golden source of truth of the trade that we've both entered. If I go back in time to when I was building my commodities futures exchange, my trade workflow, when we implemented straight through processing to London Clearinghouse and to NASDAQ and in and out of SGX in Singapore, we had deep problems in the fact that whilst we would get trades formed and we're handing over the matched trade into a straight through process, we would have a trade verification delay. And that verification is a manual process going back saying, okay, do we actually have the ISDA master agreement between the two counterparties that have entered this trade? And what does that tell us about the collateral that can be allocated to the trade, et cetera, et cetera. So the clearing banks and the clearinghouse have got a number of overnight processes that they've traditionally had to step through to double check that actually the counterparties can go into the trade and they can be serviced in the way they need to be. Again, I would just reference that because I was implementing straight-through processing in 2014, 15, 16 in and out of those clearinghouses. A lot of those pipelines that got built, Toby, stay today.
Yeah.
And they were a reaction to Dodd-Frank, MiFID II, and those equivalent rules coming in around the world. So at one level, we're talking about now the modernization of that straight-through processing. We're looking at using digital ledger technology, taking the ISDA master standard as a golden source and say, okay, I now know the trade I'm intending to get into, but how do I now match that to the actual execution that we run in the market?
Which is the heart of the innovation.
Which is the heart,
yeah.
And this is important because it's that kind of expression of the real world trade that I'm entering as a life cycle of events that you capture in a smart contract and record on a timestamp record keeper, which is what a blockchain is. It's a timestamping record keeper of when something happens. And of course, what do a whole host of counterparties, clearing banks, custody banks, clearing houses all want to know at the same time? Well, when did a trade happen? When do we need to represent it in books and records to say it's now on allocation for these particular counterparties? And we hold risk and balances for those. We're talking about using a blockchain as a time-stamping record keeper, really to maintain a common consensus of record keeping, books and records. And this is powerful. This is where I think we take a lot of risk out of the life cycle of a trade. And in my humble opinion, I think there's been less investment in the mid and back office servicing over the last 10, 15 years. Definitely. I think it deserves better attention.
It's time in the sun.
Yeah, it's time in the sun is now. So I'm talking a lot, but I think this is where I connect standardization, digitization, automation. We haven't touched on automation, but you have to get the standards in place.
Yeah.
You're then digitizing the life cycle so you can actually represent it differently.
Yeah.
And that takes a little while. And then what does automation mean? Well, automation means when that smart contract representing that trade is in flight, we're automating the call to the tokenized collateral ledger to say, okay, post initial margin, because this event has just happened. So you've got the ability to automate very large parts of that mid and back office life cycle.
Which again creates that efficiency, which is why we're seeing this sort of drive for, I guess, the tokenization of real world assets within the sort of particularly asset management space. I know that's something that you've seen a fair amount of as well in recent times. Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing there and why that sort of buy side world is so keen on evolving around this.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of movement here, actually. I think there isn't a very large asset manager or hedge fund that isn't talking about
definitely
real-world asset tokenization. I think 2023 underscored probably a lot of proof of concepts and experiments as well around the world. You mentioned my trip to Southeast Asia was in Singapore for the FinTech Festival.
Yeah.
That was really a sublime event. It was over 60,000 people.
So incredible.
Absolute buzz in that market, international attendance.
You could feel it when you came back. You were thrilled about it.
No, I was thrilled because I think, firstly, all credit to the Monetary Authority of Singapore, MAS. They kind of put on that event with a number of industry partners. But Project Guardian is probably held up as a very significant program under MAS. That's been the tokenization of bonds. A number of big banks have been participating in that and testing different blockchain technologies, different techniques as to how you tokenize. And at the detail level, thinking about private public key management, thinking about the rights management of an underlying asset, and then how to fractionalize or how to express it in new electronic form. So I think that project has really helped industry understand the potential of this technology and what's around the corner in terms of a digital market or digital financial market infrastructure. I think we're on a journey for a brand new financial market infrastructure over the next 5 to 7 years.
And I think that's an interesting piece, isn't it, about the journey. We spoke about this, about whether 2024 was the year that digital assets became, institutional digital assets became mainstream. And I think when we look at it, and you mentioned there that it's been proof of concepts happening and people sort of not a large asset manager not thinking about all this sort of thing, the question's always going to be about whether the digital space is ready for, or enterprise ready, or the enterprise is ready for the digital space, whichever way you want to put it around each of those. Where do you think we are in that? What needs to happen?
Yeah, I think the technology is certainly ready now. Yeah. Ironically, I looked at the technology back in 2015, 2016 to try and help me automate some of the straight-through processing into the clearing houses that I was dealing with back then, but the technology was absolutely not ready at that point. I think there's also, you need to build your scorecard to assess digital ledger technology and is it fit for purpose for financial services. I think a lot of businesses have been doing that. Certainly a lot of trade associations have helped characterize what is a private blockchain, what is a permissionless blockchain. I think
there's no doubt the appetite is there.
The appetite is there.
The change in narrative over the last eight years or so, I would say, since we first started talking about it in the space. It's from absolute, this is a completely decentralized, it's a money laundering world, to where the convergence is very much happening now, to we can utilize this and this can create a much slicker financial services system. That's definitely on a pathway that we've seen.
Oh, it is, and the drivers are coming from a number of places. I think at one level we definitely see that cryptocurrencies act as a pathfinder, if you like, for industry to say, there's a different technology underpinning how currency can function. Yes, it was expressed in a particular form as a cryptocurrency, but we've certainly seen over 2023 a lot more conversation going on around stablecoins. I think more importantly, we've seen 105 central banks in the world talk about central bank digital currencies.
Is that right?
Yeah. And so we've got pilot schemes up and running in a lot of nations now for central bank digital currencies. So we're going to see wholesale money, we're going to see retail money transform in most of our countries in our sovereign regions of the world over the next 10 years. And that's exciting. But that will then also drive a change in the broader ecosystem, because if I'm digitizing central bank digital money, then actually how I trade bonds is going to change. It will have an implication all the way through to equity trading. We will see the tokenization of equities. It's kind of a little bit crazy that I'll list my company on a stock market and then get my shares issued, and I'll get them in paper form, and then I'll try and digitize them in a third-party platform so I can share them with my investors. And really all of that can be done at source. The stock markets could easily be using this new technology to tokenize and express shares and rights management now through smart contracts and in digital form natively. I think that's probably the other thing I've observed this year, is that we have to accept that, to my earlier point, that technologies take time to adopt. I think there is a little bit of nervousness and understanding. There's a knowledge gap around, okay, how do I tokenize collateral? I'm using collateral as the example, but if I'm tokenizing a real world asset like property or a bond that is sitting today in a traditional Oracle database or in a share certificate form in a vault, so how do I take that off-chain asset and now express it in its new tokenized form? And there's two arguments there. One, you don't really want to double count the asset and have risk in your new trading system. You really should be writing the asset natively to a chain and representing it natively on a chain. I observe really a lot of firms are finding that step difficult. That's too big a step to shut down existing technologies and migrate fully over to the blockchain and trust it. So what we're seeing really is the digital twinning of an underlying asset. So I will virtually represent the off-chain asset, the real-world asset in a chain, in token form. And you'll create a link between the two to say, okay, I've got it here and I don't want to double spend it, but I do want to express it in new form and give it the mobility that it requires. And I think 2024 is going to be a lot about that. We'll see a lot of that activity going on.
You mentioned before about hype cycles, you mentioned about automation, and I think if you look at the AI side of where automation can go, etc., we're seeing this incredible hype cycle moving through at pace that we haven't seen before in any sort of area. I think part of that, the concern about that, as you mentioned beforehand, about people's knowledge gaps, etc., etc. What we're also seeing is a sort of fear that sort of comes around automation at the same sort of time. Automation effectively makes people immediately think of where's my job going, where's my future going, etc., etc. What do I do? And the robots taking over all of these sort of extremities that we hear about it. I have a slightly different view on that. I think it's one which you echo a little bit. So talk to me a little bit about where you feel that sort of sits.
I think for society that's always a nervous conversation. I always remind myself of changes that happen through the industrial age. And have to then remind myself that, well, how far into the information digital age are we really? I had the honor of growing up with optical networks being the backbone for how data starts to move around the world in the late 80s, early 90s. And without that infrastructure coming in, we wouldn't be really sitting here talking about a lot of these new techniques.
Yeah.
So I think through the concepts of modernizing work, I think the challenge for humans personally too is that a lot of humans equate their value to the tasks they complete on a daily basis, as opposed to the value they enable. And a lot of automation techniques should be really perceived about, I shouldn't be judged on the tasks I complete, I should be judged on the value I enable or the value I create.
Yeah.
And I think for society that's a pivot that we've really got to try and embrace.
It's difficult as well with certain things. It's very clear. You mentioned sales earlier on. It's one of the easiest things to immediately do, and that's where the sales world has been sat for a long time. There's certain other areas where I think it's a little bit more tricky to equate that value, isn't it? And that's where the sort of stagnation of that sort of thought process comes into it. I was on a panel the other day which asked me, one of the questions that came through was one which amused me at the time and has made me think about it almost every day subsequently, which was, what do you think the workplace will look like in 2053, which seemed like a long way off. And I look at it and think, I've been working now for 26, 27 years.
Gosh, you don't look that.
Well, thank you very much. I started very young. But you look at it, you look back and you think, actually the workplace hasn't, whilst there's been such technological drive over that sort of period, it's fundamentally, there's a lot of similarities and just improvements over the process. And I think we probably overestimate exactly where these changes will take us without recognising that this is all about just a continuous drive for a much more efficient way of everyone existing.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is that thing, which is that through automation, if we can take risk out of systems, then it paves the way for new customers, new markets, new opportunities, new products to be designed.
Work as well being done at the same time.
And I think we see that if we jump over for a second, one of the asset classes we worked on to start with was the voluntary carbon credit. Timely as we've come to the tail end of this year with the COP28 conference running, but the voluntary carbon credit is actually a really critical, important part of getting towards net zero and removing emissions from the world. But it is a financial instrument. It does require a derivative overlay. We need to enable trade finance to come into very meaningful carbon projects around the world. And so actually that should be a digital native asset class. It's going to be a very, very big asset class, but it should be tokenized from source. A carbon project should be expressed in token form and represented as a digital asset in the world. And it is one that needs to be global in nature. You know, how I trade a metric ton of CO2, that's a universal currency.
It's the next phase of commodities, for you mentioned it beforehand, right? And, and I think this is why I'm so excited about the space at the moment, is there's so many generational differentiations happening at the moment through digital assets and the technology that underlies it, through to ESG and everything to do with carbons, as we're talking about at the moment, through to, you mentioned cloud, which feels old hat at the moment, but there's still worlds to be changed around all of those sort of areas. There's so much happening in this sort of space, underpinned by a dramatic changes in regulation, constant changes in regulation to do that. And maybe that's a good place for us to finish, because we could be talking forever about all of this sort of thing.
We could.
There is, you mentioned since 2008, and it doesn't stop gathering pace in terms of what we're seeing and where we're going. Tell me a little bit about the regulatory landscape and what that means for you, for the sector, for the people you work for.
Yeah, it will continue to evolve. I think 2023 has underscored probably 24 in Europe being probably the most mature, in my humble opinion.
Yeah.
We've got the MiFID II legislation covering traditional assets and how they should be managed, but we've seen the MiCA regulation across digital assets. And the upcoming DORA, this is the Digital Operation Resilience Act. 2024 is a readiness year for a lot of firms, because that really comes into enforcement in January 2025. But I think across those three particular policies, those three regulations, it is a framework really for how traditional assets and digital assets can converge and be regulatory compliant and be operationally resilient.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited really about what that landscape paves the way for, and Europe has a very significant lead in actually bringing that work together.
Well, I think there's been a lot of work to make that happen as well, hasn't it? Europe has been pretty embattled for the last few years, and I think not only the European government but also our own government here in the UK have recognised the potential to steal a march here and to be that, and have been very Yeah, as to be fair, despite all the criticism and everything you want to say about governments and such, I think this country has been very, very good at creating an opportunity for technology to thrive over here, and that's what's made it particularly within FX as well.
And FinTech London is thriving.
Yeah.
And I agree. I think the FCA and HM Treasury and the Law Commission have all done amazing work this year. I think there was a big appetite next year for the digital security sandbox will be running under the HM Treasury. FCA is keen to bring the right governance in place to the digital assets industry, but is willing to support the fintech markets in really helping new assets and new techniques be embraced. I refer to the UK Law Commission because actually I think they did one of the most pioneering pieces of work in the last 100 years this year with the Electronic Trade Act being published and going through the House of Lords, and that's enshrined into law. So that gives the ability to recognise effectively electronic signatures in a legal contract, and they pave the way also in some definition work for smart legal contracts. And this is important for listeners, really, Toby, for the concept that the cryptocurrency era talked a lot about code is law, and there's this anarchy, if you like, that's gone on that no, we're running new venues and we're trading in a different way and we don't have to comply to regulation. That's not true. Law is law. Code is a technology enabler, but law is law. If I'm in a derivative contract, I'm subject to common law, I'm subject to bankruptcy law, I'm subject to property law.
Kind of like the chutzpah of it all, though, don't you?
and so you have to rely on traditional law methods to help you in a remedy, in an insolvency. But yes, I can blend law conditionally now with digital techniques and make sure I'm risk managing the ins and outs of how do I recover an asset subject to property law. So my excitement there, by the way, is look at the job creation that convergence is going to create. We're having modern digital law techniques, conditional logic philosophies into new trading systems. I think the opportunities over the next 10 years in employment are cerebrally demanding, but actually fantastic.
And I think that's the key piece, isn't it? The cerebrally demanding piece, and needs people to just think in a different way and move it further forward. I mean, this has been fascinating and so much to take on board, and I think it's been massively valuable, so I really appreciate it. I want to finish just by saying that loads of people want to find out a little bit more. There's so much more to peel back. There's loads of interesting things you're doing as a business. I want you to tell us who should be reaching out to you and how should they do it. And I also want you to sort of finish by giving us a little bit of tell us what we can expect to see from you guys, what's exciting for the company in 2024, and then who should be reaching out to you and how do they do it.
Very cool. 2024 we'll see Tokenovate launch its platform in Q1 of 2024.
That's exciting.
That platform is asset class agnostic. It's been built through the pathways of interest rate derivatives and the voluntary carbon derivatives framework, but ultimately it's available for all asset classes. Who should be interested? Asset managers, fund managers that are looking to express their trades and solve collateral mobility once and for all and take some of the T+2 pain out of their workflows. But it's also for all buyers and sellers, intermediary brokers, custody banks and clearing houses. We sit up and down the whole derivative life cycle from pre-trade to post-trade. It's a life cycle engine. And if you're in the space to think about your framework and modernizing that trading life cycle, take risk out, we would love to be talking. And our best place to go for information is our website, tokenovate.com. And we run a blog to try and talk a lot about these transformations that are happening across that life cycle and some of these things that are coming in from digitization, automation, and the convergence with legals.
There's so much happening within all of it. It's a good place to read up and find out about it, right?
It is. It's a really, really exciting domain to work in, Toby. Actually, I love this part of the market. It's fantastic.
I can tell. Richard, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to see you again. My absolute pleasure. And thank you all for watching. We will see you soon on the next episode of FinTech Focus TV. Thanks a lot.